Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 18th International Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Law. It's a pleasure to have you all here. My name is Leonardo Jimbo, and this is the fourth panel of the third day of the event. First, in name of the ICAIL organization, I'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, Choose Brazil and Albert Einstein Israeli Hospital. Choose Brazil is currently the #1 law and government website worldwide that makes high-value legal information super easy and quick to access. Albert Einstein Israeli Hospital, our other platinum sponsor, is one of the best-known health units in Brazil and Latin America. That is reference in treatments with state-of-the-art technology and humanized care, expanding its borders with social responsibility actions, teaching, and research activities. In this panel, we will have two presentation replays that will work as follows. First, we will have a streaming of the paper's presentations that were previously recorded. After that, we will have some time for a Q&A live session with papers authors. So we invite the audience to send us questions through the chat, and I'll be glad to ask them. Without further words, let me introduce Mrs. Raja Elamadani from HEC Paris, France. Mrs. Elamadani will be presenting the paper, A Combined Rule-Based and Machine Learning Approach for Automated GDPR Compliance Checking, for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we will move on to the questions. Let's get started.
So can you please confirm that you can see my slides? Okay, great. So I'm happy today to walk you through our research project about automating GDPR compliance checking. It is a research project in collaboration with researchers from HEC Paris and Oranova. So our work comes from the context of complying with the data protection laws. So complying with the GDPR is challenging, and one of the reasons is that personal data flows in complex data supply chains. And although companies are using technology to deal with this complexity, there isn't a comprehensive framework defining end-to-end compliance. So the objective of our research is to fill this gap by first building a conceptual framework for GDPR compliance, and second, to test this framework by automating the compliance checking of privacy policies against the GDPR. The framework that we developed is document-centric because the GDPR entrusts documents with different functions. For example, controllers and processors must maintain a record of processing activities according to Article 30. So the starting point of our framework are compliance documents that we define as documents that establish the conditions and processing activities that data controllers and processors are intended to and should carry out. Such documents are privacy policies and data protection addendums. It could be also contracts containing clauses about data protection or internal company documents. And so these documents, we suggest that they should be automatically analyzed. First, to ensure their compliance with regulation, both on a functional level and substantial level. Then the documents should be compliant in the data supply chain, which means that we verify the documents in the light of contractual standards or another document with a higher hierarchy in the supply chain. And last, we assess the adequacy between operations, documents, and regulations, so that we also ensure that operations of processing personal data are compliant with the regulations. To test our framework, we first apply it to analyze privacy policies compliance in the data supply chain. And we start with privacy policies because they are the compliance documents that appear at the top of the data supply chain, since they communicate information to data subjects. And we define the tasks to check for formal compliance, which is the first level of the compliance framework we suggest. And the tasks that we end up with are the checking of the presence of mandatory information according to Articles 13 and 14, and also the readability and clarity of the language, which is defined in Article 12 of the GDPR. And in this research project, we focus on the first task, which is the detection of mandatory information. So our system is composed from two modules. The first one segments privacy policies into paragraphs, and then we predict data practices from each paragraph. The data practices are then used as input to the second module of the system, which is a rule-based model, in order to detect the mandatory information that are mentioned in the privacy policy. And first, I will walk you through the algorithms we built for the extraction of data practices. So we use machine learning and as a training data set, we used the OPP-115 corpus, which contains 115 privacy policies annotated and publicly released by researchers of the Usable Privacy Project. And as you can see, the taxonomy is hierarchical, and it is composed of 10 categories of data practices. And here we show only the categories that we used for the compliance checking. And each category has a set of attributes, and each attribute has a set of predefined values. So here we have an example of an annotated segment from IMDb privacy policy. And the annotator first selected the first party collection use category. And this category has different attributes, such as personal information type. And the annotator selects the values of these attributes by reading this segment. And the annotator also highlights the text in the segment that corresponds to the value. So for example, for the value computer information, the annotator highlighted login password. And so since the the taxonomy is hierarchical, first level we have the categories, and each category has children attributes. And for each attribute, we need to predict the values. We treat this problem as hierarchical multi-label text classification task. And we experiment with two approaches. We first try the local classifiers approach, and then a second approach, which is based on a text-to-text framework. The training dataset is composed of 115 privacy policies, which is small in comparison to the label's size. So in order to obtain good performance, one common ingredient for both local classifiers and text-to-text approach is to use transfer learning where first a language model is pre-trained on a large data set of online text, and then the learned knowledge is transferred to train data practice predictor on the dataset of annotated privacy policies. So for the local classifiers approach, at the training time, we need to train one local multi-label classifier to predict the higher level categories, and then one local multi-label classifier for each attribute to predict the values for that attribute. And as you can see here, the training for this set of local classifier is done independently from each other. And at inference time, the predictions are made in a top-down order, where first categories are predicted by the higher level local classifier. And then for each attribute associated with the predicted categories, for example, if we only predicted this category, we would only use the local classifiers associated with these attributes in order to predict their values. And for the local classifiers, we choose to use the same local classifier for all the levels and the nodes. And we first reproduce prior work by the authors of policies and use a convolutional neural network as the base classifier. Segments are first embedded with word embeddings that were trained on more than 130,000 privacy policies. And this allows us to have a good baseline to compare with the other approaches. And since the state of the art these recent years is transformers for NLP tasks, so we conduct a second experiment by using a transformer model, and precisely the ExcelNet model, which we first used the pre-trained one, which is publicly available, and then we fine-tune it first for the prediction of the categories, and then to predict the attributes values, which means that we fine-tune it 21 times for the 21 tasks. And here are the results for both tasks and for this approach of local classifiers, and by both the convolutional neural networks model and the ExcelNet model. And as you can see here for the first task, ExcelNet has superior performance comparing to CNN for the task of categories prediction. However, it has significantly lower performance than CNN for the second task. And we think that it is the case because there are enough examples to fine-tune ExcelNet for the first task, but not enough for values prediction, given that ExcelNet is much larger than CNN. And so the results are of the classifiers are good for certain tasks and categories, but the local classifiers approach has two main drawbacks. The first one is that it trains the set of local classifiers independently, so the classes hierarchy isn't captured, and the classes hierarchy is important if we want to improve the predictions of the values. And the second drawback is that the number of classifiers grows linearly with the size of the label hierarchy, which means we need more compute power and time, both for the training time and inference time. To deal with these limitations, we suggest to use a text-to-text approach. Why? Because text-to-text frameworks cast every NLP task into a text-to-text problems, such that both the input and output are text. And the main advantage of this is that we can use the same model for all the NLP tasks. So for example, even this task of computing the semantic similarity between sentence 1 and sentence 2, which is a regression task since the output is a number, could be converted to a text-to-text task, and it could be solved using the same model that was used for translation or for summarization. And we use T5, which is a pre-trained language model based on the transformer architecture to implement the text-to-text approach for our task of data practices prediction. We first need to convert the task of extracting data practices into text-to-text. We do this by first splitting this task into two tasks. The first one is to predict the categories for the segment, and the second one is to predict then the values and also the span of text corresponding to the values. And we prepare the first task of categories prediction by prepending the categories prediction prefix to the text of segments. And for the target, we convert it by generating a sequence of the categories and separating them by a semicolon. And for the second task, which is the prediction of the values, we convert it to similarly to reading comprehension task, where we use the prefix values prediction and context to indicate to the model what is the segment from which we want to predict the values and also extract the text. And we give it also the category in order to keep the hierarchy in the model, and also the attribute for which we want to know the value. And the target is transformed by first by starting with the span of text we want to extract, and by putting between brackets the value of the attribute. Once we pre-process the data and we convert it into a text-to-text format, we fine-tune the T5 by fine-tuning the largest available model, which has 11 billion parameters on these tasks. And we try two fine-tuning methods. So T5 could either be fine-tuned in an independent way, such that we first fine-tune it on the task of categories prediction and then on the task of values prediction. And in this way, we have two models. And the second way to do it is to fine-tune it in a multi-task setting on a mixture of both tasks to capture the global labels hierarchy. And when we look at the results, we see that the both ways of fine-tuning have close recall and for both tasks, but the precision is significantly higher when we fine-tune on each task separately, which is what the authors of T5 recommended. And the performance for span extraction is good for a baseline, but we think that it is low in comparison with the performance of the same model T5 on similar tasks such as reading comprehension or named entity recognition. So we need to work more on this task. And as a global comparison between the two approaches of local classifiers and text-to-text, both XNet and T5 performs significantly higher than CNN for the first task, but the performance is at best similar to CNN for the second task. And for later experiments, we select to work with the G5 because of both the performance and is also capable of doing span extraction, with which the local classifiers cannot do. And once we finish extracting the data practices, then we feed them to the second model of our system in order to detect the mandatory informations. Here we list the mandatory informations that our legal experts were able to encode using the OPP taxonomy. So this taxonomy was created before GDPR, so we weren't able to encode all the mandatory informations because it doesn't contain all the concepts needed for the GDPR. And we choose JSON logic to serialize obtained rules because it comes with a parser that we use to build a first order logic inference engine with Python. And here is an example of encoding a rule that states the obligation of mentioning the purpose of the processing of personal data. And for evaluation of this part of mandatory information, we created 2 data sets annotated with the mandatory information, 15 pre-GDPR privacy policies and 15 post-GDPR privacy policies. And we noticed that most of the errors on the OPP privacy policies are caused by the difficulty of aligning OPP concepts with GDPR. So, for example, to encode data retention period, we use the retention period attribute. However, it doesn't correspond to what is required by the GDPR. And in the other hand, the majority of errors on the post-GDPR policies are when the algorithm does not detect the right to data portability. And this is expected because data portability has not been widely adopted before the GDPR. And so the training data set didn't contain that concept, and therefore the algorithm and inference time wasn't able to capture it very well. And the bonus with the G5 is that it is capable of predicting new categories of data practices due to its language understanding capabilities that enable few and zero-shot inference. So when we gave segments from post-GDPR privacy policies, it was able to predict new categories that weren't in the training data set, but that they correspond to concepts from GDPR articles such as legitimate interest or data minimization. And this could be helpful if we want, for example, to create a GDPR taxonomy from compliance documents. And to conclude our work, I like to say that this work consisted in the creation of a framework to implement automated GDPR compliance in the data supply chain. And we proposed an automatic way based on machine learning and a rule-based model to implement the detection of mandatory information from privacy policies. And we also dealt with the limitations of local classifiers by suggesting a text-to-text framework. And you could test with our approach since we released the models and data sets that you could find on GitHub. And for future work, we would like to apply the compliance framework to other documents such as the DPIAs and define what would be the compliance tasks to verify the compliance of these documents, implemented in a way that takes into account that companies and work with multi-documents. So we need to check in a multi-document setting. And of course, create data sets that are annotated with GDPR taxonomy, especially if we want to work with other compliance documents. So thank you all for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Ms. Raja. It was very interesting. Now I will ask you a question from the audience. Our first question is it possible to formalize in logical terms open textual rules, such as the lawful base, legitimate interest? What are the main challenges to implement this task?
Thank you, Leonardo, for communicating this question. So it's a good question, especially the example of legitimate interest. We tried to encode legitimate interest with the OPP taxonomy, but we couldn't because we didn't find the right concepts to encode it. And we also tried to define with legal experts what are all the possible ways of mentioning legitimate interest, or what are the rules. And that also was difficult because it's very, very large. But a data-driven approach is promising because one of the concepts and categories that was predicted by T5 in the zero-shot setting is legitimate interest. So if we annotate the expressions of legitimate interest on privacy policies or any other documents, I think a natural language processing approach would be able to extract the legitimate interest or other open textured concepts from the text given its context.
Okay, thank you. And we have a second question that is, your experiment is focused on privacy policies. As you mentioned, the intention to adapt the framework to other documents, such as the BIAs. What are the main challenges for this adaptation? And if I could complement this question, I would kind of ask you to comment the possibilities of using in this framework existing privacy ontologies like Pronto that are compliant with some GDPR policies.
But, so our framework is could be adapted to other documents because the levels of compliance that we defined are defined in a way, an abstract way, in order to take into account all the compliance documents of the GDPR. So the first step would be to look into those levels and then define, apply them to the DPIAs in order to define what would be the compliance tasks for the DPIA. And then for in terms of extracting automatically the information, compliance information from the DPIA, that's when we would need to create a training dataset, since the dataset that we have is doesn't contain all the GDPR concepts that we need. And that's where ontologies of GDPR like Pronto would be helpful to annotate the documents. And there is also one that was created specifically for the DPIA. It's called DPMF, and it contains the concepts needed for the DPIA. So I think the main challenge for this framework to work, especially the automatic information extraction, is to annotate enough documents with the GDPR concepts that are important for compliance checking.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And you have 1 minute left. Would you like to make any final considerations?
I just would like to thank you all, thank the organizations for this great work and organizing such a conference that holds across time zones, especially.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. So congratulations for an interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to introduce Mr. Lucia Zhang. She is a master's student in computer science at Stanford University and a student fellow at the Stanford Regulation Evaluation and Governance Lab, and also Mr. Neil Guha, also from Stanford University, who will join us in the Q&A. Mr. Zhang will be presenting the paper, When Does Pre-Training Help? Accessing Self-Supervised Learning for Law and the Case Hold Dataset of 53,000 plus legal holdings for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we will move on to the questions. Let's get started.
I'm Lucia Zhang, a master's student in computer science at Stanford University. My co-authors are a team of interdisciplinary researchers at Stanford. Neil Guha and Peter Henderson are JD PhD students in computer science. Brandon Anderson is a data scientist, and Daniel Ho is a professor of law and political science at Stanford University. Today, I'll be presenting on our paper, When Does Pre-Training Help? Assessing Self-Supervised Learning for the Law. In this work, we aim to establish a set of NLP benchmark tasks for the legal domain and explore the conditions for which domain-specific pre-training may be worthwhile. It has been said that NLP has hit its ImageNet moment with the rise of large language models like BERT. However, curiously, existing work has reported marginal gains for pre-training large language models on law, particularly compared to the much more significant gains achieved by domain-specific pre-training in other fields, such as biomedicine and computer science. As an example, consider the core NLP task of text classification. The Chalkaitis work, one of the most comprehensive existing evaluations of pre-trained language model performance on legal NLP tasks, finds that the macro F1 gain of BERT pre-trained on law over base BERT is only 2.5, and the gain is even smaller for other tasks like named entity recognition. In contrast, the authors of the SciBERT paper showed that a BERT model pre-trained on scientific text with a custom scientific vocabulary achieves a 7.07 gain in macro F1 on a text classification task. It's worth noting that some of the large differences reported in related work like BioBERT compare BERT pre-trained at 1 million iterations and a domain-specific pre-trained model on top of BERT at 2 million iterations. And therefore, the result may be confounded by this. In light of work by the authors of Roberta, which suggests that BERT was significantly undertrained and can achieve higher performance by simply pre-training the model longer. We'll discuss how we address this issue more in our evaluation. So this all leads to the question, why have such large gains from domain-specific pre-training not been observed in law? We hypothesize that existing benchmark legal NLP tasks are not adequately difficult enough to satisfy the conditions under which significant gains from domain-specific pre-training can be observed. This may be due to the expense of hiring lawyers with legal knowledge to manually label datasets for difficult legal tasks. As a result, many private companies are unlikely to make investments in labeling unless it is for solvable tasks. So existing legal NLP datasets are not only small or proprietary, but also tend to reflect lower difficulty tasks that have been solved by methods often predating the rise of self-supervised learning and models like BERT. Armed with this hypothesis, we set about trying to construct a new large labeled dataset for more difficult legal NLP tasks. As mentioned, this is often quite expensive due to human annotation costs. So we ask ourselves, instead of relying on expert annotation, can we extract signals from case law language in a systemic way to create a task? It turns out that the answer is yes, and this is because of one of the unique aspects of case law language, that it is stylistically governed by the Blue Book rules of legal citation, which set a standard for how legal citations appear in case law. This brings us to our key idea. We could create a multiple choice question answering task by leveraging these standardized rules to extract holding statements in case law. Holdings express governing legal rules when law is applied to a particular set of facts. They are precedential, which means they are what litigants rely on for subsequent cases. In case law, holdings follow legal citations and frequently begin with the keyword holding in parentheticals, as this format is strongly recommended by Blue Book. Using this idea, we created a new benchmark dataset, CaseHold. The next slide shows one example from the CaseHold dataset. On the left in gray is a citation and its citing context. We replace the location of the holding statement in the citing text with a holding token in brackets. On the right are the 5 multiple choice options for the citing text. The green boxes are incorrect holding statements matched with the citing text prompt, and the green box contains the correct holding statement that corresponds to the citation in the case law. This dataset has around 50,000 examples, comparable in size to other general domain NLP tasks, such as SQUAD and SWAG. To construct the casehold dataset, we extract all citing context, citations, and holding statements from a holdout set of the Harvard Law corpus, which is around 10% of the total corpus. We use the other 90% of the corpus for pre-training models, which we'll discuss in more detail in a few slides. Each example in the dataset consists of a prompt formed from the citing text and citation, one correct answer, which is the true corresponding holding statement found in the original text, and 4 semantically similar but incorrect answers, which are other holding statements sampled from the pool of all extracted holding statements. To match a prompt with 4 incorrect answers, we calculate the TF-IDF similarity between the correct holding statement and the other holding statements and match the prompt with the other holding statements with high similarity. We also set an upper threshold for similarity to prevent the matching of holding statements that parrot or paraphrase the true holding statement, which would make the task impossible. We also evaluate our model on 2 other benchmark datasets. The first is the overruling dataset, which simulates a binary classification task to determine whether a statement is overruling or not. This dataset is fairly small, consisting of 2,400 examples, and was created by Casetext, a company that collaborated with our team to release the dataset publicly. The second is the terms of service dataset, which also simulates a binary classification test to determine whether a consumer contract term is potentially unfair or not. This dataset was manually labeled by legal experts and contains around 9,400 examples. It was created by the authors of the Claudette paper cited on this slide. Next, we'll talk about the methods used to evaluate these legal benchmark tasks. To begin, we'll introduce the central BERT transfer learning paradigm, which we use to train our domain-specific models for law. This learning process consists of 2 steps. One is unsupervised training of large amounts of unlabeled text. In the case of base BERT in Devlin et al., the original paper, this is a general domain books corpus and Wikipedia. But as we'll see, this can be domain-specific text as well. BERT is pre-trained on this unlabeled text using 2 training objectives, masked language modeling and next sentence prediction. For the MLM objective, BERT masks random tokens in the input text and predicts the masked token. For the NSP objective, BERT predicts whether in a pair of sentences, the second sentence is the subsequent sentence of the first sentence in the original text. The second step is supervised fine-tuning on a specific downstream task with a labeled dataset. Using casehold as an example, we feed BERT citing text prompts as input and train BERT to predict the correct holding statement from the 5 answer choices. We trained several models using this framework. For our baseline models, we trained a 1-layer bidirectional LSTM initialized with 300-dimensional word-to-vec embeddings. For our baseline BERT model, we used the base BERT uncased model with 110 million parameters from the original BERT paper by Devlin et al. We also train a BERT double model initialized with base BERT parameters and pre-trained for an additional 1 million steps on the general domain Wikipedia corpus used to train base BERT. BERT double provides us with a model that is pre-trained for 2 million total steps for direct comparison against our legal domain-specific BERT models, which are also pre-trained for that many steps, addressing the confounding issue discussed earlier. Legal BERT is initialized with base BERT parameters and pre-trained for an additional 1 million steps on the case law corpus, the 90% of the Harvard Law corpus introduced earlier. But it uses the same general domain vocabulary as base BERT. Custom legal BERT is pre-trained from scratch for 2 million steps on the case law corpus with a custom legal domain-specific vocabulary constructed using sentence piece on a subset of sentences from the case law corpus. With some initial exploration of model behavior, we can see the significant benefit of a domain-specific pre-training corpus and vocabulary for legal domain-specific reasoning. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here's a quote by Justice Marshall from Marbury v. Madison. "The very essence of civil liberty certainly consists in the right of every individual to claim the protection of the laws whenever he receives an injury." We can transform this quote for mass language modeling by masking out the last word, injury, and feeding this input to our BERT model. We would like the BERT model to correctly predict that the masked word is injury. We observed that base BERT and BERT double do not predict the correct completion within the top 5 completions with highest likelihood. I think base BERT predicts action and BERT double predicts emergency. But legal BERT predicts the correct completion, injury, correctly. This demonstrates that domain-specific pre-training on legal text significantly improves model accuracy for tasks for which the pre-training text provides relevant knowledge, in our case, case law. Custom legal BERT predicts correctly as well, though this is not pictured in the slides. As another example, take the definition of the word affidavit from LEX, the Cornell Law School Legal Information Institute Legal Dictionary and Encyclopedia. Here, we transform the input by masking the defined word affidavit and have BERT predict this masked word. We observe that our BERT double and legal BERT models predict that the most likely word is oath, which is similar in meaning, but not as technically precise as affidavit. Custom legal BERT, on the other hand, predicts the correct word affidavit and attributes high likelihood to this prediction. We see about 80%. Affidavit is in the legal domain-specific vocabulary for custom legal BERT, but not in the general domain vocabulary of BERT double and legal BERT. This suggests that the custom vocabulary contributes to additional gains beyond those from domain-specific pre-training only, especially for tasks that contain highly domain-specific terminology. We zoom out a little now to briefly discuss the details of unsupervised pre-training and supervised fine-tuning procedures we used for evaluation, and then we will present the results of the base setup and some variants. We use the pre-training procedure detailed in Devlin et al. With a few adaptations for improved performance on legal texts. One adaptation we implemented was a custom sentence segmenter that uses regular expressions based on Blue Book rules to keep legal citations together for next sentence prediction pre-training. This change was important because traditional segmenters use period characters as sentence delimiters, but there are many non-sentence delimiting periods in case law. We also used whole word masking for the masked language modeling pre-training objective. This change masks whole words rather than subtokens, forcing BERT to predict entire domain-specific terms, which are often not present in the general domain vocabulary and therefore frequently tokenized into subtokens. For fine-tuning, we use the input transformations presented in Bradford et al., which allow us to train on different downstream tasks while making limited adjustments to the model architectures. Here, the green model box represents the section of the pipeline where we can slot in any of our previously described pre-trained BERT models. We'll go through the multiple choice question answering pipeline in a little more detail here, but the classification pipeline is similar. Using casehold as an example, we transform a particular example from the dataset so that the prompt is concatenated to each answer choice separately and separated by a start, delimiting, and end token. We feed each independently to the pre-trained BERT model we would like to evaluate, and this output goes through a classification head composed of a linear layer and softmax to produce a prediction of which answer choice is correct. The text below the diagram shows how this would be done for the original caseload example presented earlier. The following base setup results use this pre-training and fine-tuning procedure to evaluate the 3 benchmark tasks with tenfold cross-validation. We report average macro F1 as our performance metric. We observe that the baseline model performance for overruling is high. This is likely because the overruling task is comparatively easy. The task reduces to identifying the presence of keywords like overruled and disapprove in many cases, as these keywords commonly appear in overruling sentences. The baseline performance on terms of service and caseload is lower, which tells us that these tasks are more difficult and cannot easily be solved with a BILSTM or base BERT. We see that BERT double and legal BERT achieve marginal gains over base BERT for overruling, which substantiates our earlier hypothesis that existing legal NLP tasks may not be sufficiently difficult to observe significant gains from pre-training language models on law. We see that BERT double achieves much higher F1 on terms of service compared to base BERT, but that legal BERT is not necessarily more performant for this task. This is likely because though terms of service is a more difficult task than overruling, the task language is extracted from consumer contracts, which contains more common language and less language similar to case law. In contrast, there is a 5.7 gain in F1 between BERT double and legal BERT, which suggests that the casehold task is both adequately difficult and domain-specific enough to satisfy the conditions for which more substantial gains from domain-specific pre-training are observed. Lastly, we see that custom legal BERT achieves the highest performance on all three benchmarks. The F1 scores are bolded in the table. In particular, we see additional gains beyond just domain-specific pre-training from a custom domain-specific vocabulary, as reported in other domains outside of law. We also attempted to define a more quantitative measure of domain specificity, which we call DS score. It is computed by taking the average difference in pre-train loss between legal BERT and BERT double over the dataset evaluated on the downstream task of interest. If a DS score is positive, this implies that legal BERT with legal domain-specific pre-training is able to reason more accurately about the task compared to BERT with general domain pre-training before any fine-tuning. These DS scores are reported in blue here. We see that the rank order of the DS scores matches our qualitative understanding of the domain specificity of the three tasks, with terms of service being the least domain specific and having the lowest DS score, and casehold being the most domain specific and having the highest DS score. We also evaluate the model on a few task variants. We discuss one of them here, and the rest are included in the paper. For the train volume variant, we vary the size of the casehold training set. This plot shows that legal BERT dramatically outperforms BERT double in precisely the setting that is relevant to law, where there is limited labeled training data. In conclusion, we present a new legal NLP dataset, casehold. This dataset illustrates the advantages of leveraging domain-specific knowledge, the standardized Blue Book format for holding statements in case law, to construct legal NLP datasets. Using casehold, we show gains from pre-training language models on law comparable to the largest gains reported by CyBERT and BioBERT. We hope this contribution drives excitement and interest in solving more difficult legal NLP tasks. Additionally, we outline two conditions that help identify where domain-specific pre-training may be worthwhile: task difficulty and domain specificity, and offer some ideas such as DS score about how to quantify these qualities of a task. This may guide practitioners in deciding when resource-intensive pre-training is necessary in the future. We close by sharing some resources. The legal benchmark datasets and the code for fine-tuning to replicate reported results are available at this GitHub link. We also invite you to download and explore our pre-trained language models for law on the Hugging Face model repository. You can explore model behavior using the Marbury v. Madison and the affidavit example from the slides, or any other descriptive examples of your choosing in the browser on the Hugging Face model pages. Thank you for listening. Neil and I are happy to take any questions, and our contact information is also on this slide.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Mrs. Zhang. It was very interesting. Now we can move on to the question. But before that, would you like to make any additional comments to the previous recorded presentation, Mr. Guha?
No, I'd love to hear the questions that folks have.
Okay, let's go. The first question is, due to their financial costs, are pre-trained models only recommended for difficult and complex tasks in the legal domain?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think it's important to distinguish between, I'm assuming the question's asking whether we're recommending pre-trained legal models over general purpose legal models or general purpose language models like BERT with regards to customized corpora in the legal domain. And I think that's a difficult question to answer without more facts, but I think there are a variety of considerations that might inform such a decision. So the complexity of the task is definitely a consideration. Pre-trained models, and you'd think that the reasoning patterns that are present in a corpus are more likely to be important the more complex the task is. And I think that's what our work shows, especially with the performance improvements on casehold. But also other considerations include the alignment between the pre-training corpus and the data set for the task that you care about. The closer those two data sets are aligned, the more likely you're going to see a benefit from pre-training on a customized corpus. And finally is a question about the amount of data you have for the fine-tuning or end goal task. If you have less data, that suggests, and our results also indicate this, that you're probably going to want to pre-train on a, you're more likely to want to pre-train on a customized legal corpora. If you have a lot more data, then it seems like you can get away with using an existing model that's been pre-trained on a more general corpus.
Great. And we have another question from Thorne McCarthy. He said, your best result were from custom legal bird. What was the training time and training cost for this model? Are you using GPUs or TPUs?
Yeah, so we trained it for 2 million steps on Google Colab TPUs, which I think took a couple of days, if I recall correctly. Because we were using Google Colab TPUs, and at the time, Google was freely giving away TPU compute. We didn't actually have to pay for it, but I'm sure I could pull up an estimate for you offline to find what the actual cost would have been. But yeah, we were really lucky that we were able to leverage this resource, and it was fantastic. Sorry, Leonardo, I think you're muted.
Oh, great, thank you. We have another one from Sabine Werner. Do you think one can profile the training corpora to support the claims about legal bird, such as the important keywords are probably more frequent in the legal corpora?
I think I misheard the first part of that question. I'm so sorry, could you repeat it?
The first part is, do you think one can profile the training corpora to support the claims about legal birds?
Yeah, and we did, I don't think we wrote about this in the paper, but we did look at relative word frequencies compared to samples of the legal corpora from case opinions, the more general corpora used to train what we call vanilla BERT, and we found that on sort of notable, for notable terms, there were significant discrepancies. And I think the examples presented earlier in the presentation in the slide with regard to affidavits show how this can manifest in a difference in performance.
Okay, great. And we have a final question. And at the end of your paper, you say that code, deciding whether you want to pre-train yourself can therefore have significant ethical, social, and environmental implications, unquote. Which are the main ethical, social, and environmental implications of pre-training models? Can we mitigate them?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I think a topic that's really at the forefront of mind for a lot of researchers in this field. In our paper, I think we have references to several papers that do a much more thorough job of discussing this in all its nuance and detail. So off the top of my head, the stochastic parrots paper, and there's been a lot of work on trying to catalog the environmental impact. Just sort of like a brief overview maybe is that I think pre-training is very, very computationally expensive. And as a result, there's been a lot of fantastic work cataloging the extremely large carbon footprint it has, particularly when you consider how in a full machine learning process, you're not necessarily just pre-training one model, you're doing some form of hyperparameter tuning, you're running multiple tests. And so this can grow in cost and have a significant environmental impact. And I think the other consideration relating more to the ethical and social issues that arise are that these models are extremely large and unfortunately have a tendency to memorize text and regurgitate it. And with the size of training data sets we're talking about, it can be practically difficult to filter or audit the entire data. And so the likelihood that these models are able to capture harmful biases or regurgitate information that may otherwise be private or may be hateful in some way is not low. And I think those are considerations. And like I said, there's a lot of work that we cite to in the paper that does a much better job of explaining this in all its detail. And so I'd encourage everyone to go read those papers. And yeah.
Okay, great. And we have a few minutes left. So would you like to make any final consideration, Mr. Goa?
No, I don't think so. I'd just like to echo what was said earlier about thank you so much for organizing this. We can't possibly imagine how much work and how difficult it is to put together a venture like this over Zoom across multiple time zones on these online platforms. But it's been an extraordinary experience, and we're really grateful to have the opportunity to engage with the community and that the organizers put the time and effort into this. So I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you to everyone who listened to our talk.
Okay, Mr. Goha, we just received another question, and I'd like to ask you from Jack Conrad. Could you speak to future work? What could you cite practical legal applications that would be immediately acknowledged by legal practitioners as difficult and valuable use of this training?
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, the question is asking about what are potential future work along this vein, and then what are interesting tasks we think that stretch complexity. Those are two things we're thinking a lot about. I think in terms of potential future work, one of the things we're really interested in is understanding where the divergences in performance are coming from between the custom legal BERT model and the baseline BERT model. Are there specific reasons we can identify why legal BERT is performing better? And if we can identify those reasons, can we figure out how to use them to improve performance even further? I think with regards to tasks, one of the things we really liked about the caseful data set is the extent to which we can leverage structure already existing in legal texts through holding statements, because I think that, as Lucia said, the problem with legal benchmarks is it's very, very difficult to get human labels. And so we're looking at that. There are potentially interesting things we could do around citation signals. I know there's a lot of work happening around contracts. The Quad CUAD data set recently came out, and so that's really exciting. But I think in general, this is a really exciting space, and there's lots unfolding, and we're really looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Okay, thank you very much for a great paper. And we still have a few minutes left, and we received another question from Mrs. Raja. So we have her back here to answer. The question is from James Westerman, and he asks, do you think precision or recall is more important for this task?
Hello again. Hi, Hannes. Yeah, this is an important question. For us, it's recall is more important because of the way how we deploy, we plan to deploy the system. So we would like that the system would be used by legal experts in companies who would receive the outputs of the model, for example, in the case of mandatory information detection. So the model will flag the mandatory information that was missing in the privacy policy. So if we consider here the absence of the mandatory information as the positive class, so in this case, we would like to maximize the recall in order to detect as much possible of the mandatory information that wasn't mentioned in the privacy policy.
Okay, thank you very much and congratulations again.
And
thank you. So now we will have a break for an hour and a half, and we'll be back at 6:30 p.m. GMT. Those who want to meet other participants and exchange experiences can access the Gather Town platform for a networking moment. The link is at the OpenFi platform. Thank you very much and see you soon.